There's a type of marriage that looks perfectly fine from the outside. The house is clean, the children go to school, the bills are paid, nobody's shouting, nobody is leaving. But inside that house, something has gone cold and quiet in a way that no one talks about. Two people sleeping in the same bed for years, and never once truly meeting. That is what Padre Pio called one of the most hidden wounds of the soul. Not divorce, not abuse, not betrayal, presence without being present, marriage continued without intimacy of the heart. And what he saw in the souls of those who lived this way was something that shook even him. Padre Pio of Pietrelcina, born Francesco Forgione on May 25, 1887, in the small village of Pietrelcina in the province of Benevento, southern Italy, spent more than 50 years in the monastery of San Giovanni Rotondo, hearing confessions, sometimes 16 to 18 hours a day. He heard confessions from 1916 until 1968. In those 52 years, hundreds of thousands of people sat across from him in that small wooden booth. Priests, doctors, soldiers, widows, and married people, many of them carrying something they had never told anyone, something that did not have a name in their era, something we might now call emotional abandonment, spiritual distance inside the vows, a marriage that continued in form but had stopped in truth. If you value documented testimonies from the lives of the saints and the real spiritual struggles ordinary people brought to them, subscribe now. It is the best way to support this work, and comment below from which city you are watching. This script is drawn primarily from two deeply specific sources. The collected testimonies archived in Father Gerardo di Flumeri's work, published in Italian as The Acts of the Cause of Beatification of Padre Pio, a juridical document compiled in 1983 by the postulators of his cause, which contains sworn depositions from people who personally interacted with him in the confessional context. And from the biography by C. Bernard Ruffin, Padre Pio, the True Story, revised edition of 1991, which remains the most rigorously documented English language account of his life, drawing on primary interviews conducted in San Giovanni Rotondo before many of the witnesses died. These are not devotional pamphlets. These are sworn testimonies and sourced biographies. Now back to the story. The year is 1932. A woman named Maria Caserta arrives in San Giovanni Rotondo from the province of Foggia. She has been married for 14 years. Her husband is alive. He has not struck her. He has not left her. He goes to Mass. He works. But for 11 of those 14 years, he has not spoken to her except to issue instructions. He eats at the table and looks at the wall. He sleeps in the bed and keeps his back turned. She does not know what she did. She has asked. He has not answered. She has wept. He has not acknowledged the tears. She has prayed. She has confessed. She has tried everything she knows. And now she is sitting in line at the confessional of Padre Pio at the Church of Our Lady of Grace, waiting for her turn. When she finally enters and begins to speak, Padre Pio stops her almost immediately. According to the deposition given by the friar Father Aurelio, who was present in the sacristy that day, Padre Pio looked at the woman and said something that made her freeze. He said, not unkindly but with weight, that he already knew what she carried. He said that her husband's silence was a wound he had chosen to keep rather than heal, and that she had been faithful when most people would have broken. Then he said something she had not expected. He told her that the damage done by a heart that withdraws inside a marriage is not less than the damage done by a heart that runs away from it. It is slower, but it cuts deeper. Maria Caserta left that confessional and, according to the testimony of her daughter Antonietta, recorded in an interview conducted in 1974, spent 3 days in spiritual retreat near the monastery. She returned home. Her husband did not change immediately, but she said something had changed in her. She had been given a name for the wound, and a name, she said, was the beginning of healing. That exchange is not an isolated case. It sits at the center of a pattern that appears repeatedly in documented testimonies from people who came to Padre Pio specifically about marriages that had not broken but had emptied. He heard these confessions in a very specific way. He did not ask how long the couple had been separated in spirit. He asked instead what each person was still choosing, even inside the emptiness. To understand why Padre Pio saw this so clearly, you have to understand what he believed about the nature of marital union. He did not treat marriage as a legal contract or a social arrangement. He treated it as what the theology he was trained in described it to be, a sacrament with a living interior. In his teaching, drawn from the tradition of the Capuchin order and from theologians like St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Francis de Sales, marriage was not just a bond between two people. It was a bond between two souls. And a soul that stopped showing up inside that bond was committing a kind of daily invisible abandonment. Not desertion in the legal sense, not adultery in the bodily sense, but a turning away of the interior self that, repeated over months and then years, became a form of spiritual violence. The year is 1947. A man comes to confession. He is from the region of Campania. He has been married 22 years. His wife, he says, is devout. She is kind. She raises their 4 children well. He provides for the family, but he has never, in 22 years, told her that he loves her. He has never asked her what she thinks. He has never sat with her at the end of the day and simply been there. He comes to San Giovanni Rotondo not because someone told him to. He comes because he has begun to feel, in his own words, as if he is disappearing, as if his life is a performance of a life, as if he has been present for decades and has never once arrived. Padre Pio heard this, and according to the testimony of Father Joseph Pius Martin recorded in Ruffin's biography, was silent for a long time. Then he asked the man a single question. He asked whether the man believed that God had given him a wife or given him a function. The man did not know how to answer. Padre Pio told him that a function can be fulfilled at a distance. A wife cannot. He said that the absence inside a marriage is not a private matter between 2 people. It damages children. It damages the soul of the one who withdraws and the soul of the one left waiting. And it has a weight in the spiritual order that most people completely underestimate because it leaves no visible marks. That last sentence, no visible marks. That is the thing that comes up again and again in the documented testimonies about how Padre Pio understood this wound. Physical violence leaves marks. Abandonment of the body leaves a legal record. But a husband or wife who stays, who goes through every motion, who is technically present for 20 or 30 years and never once gives their real self to the other person, leaves nothing that can be shown to a court or a doctor. It only shows up in confessions, in the quiet breakdowns of people in their 40s and 50s who cannot explain to themselves why they feel so profoundly alone inside a marriage that looks intact from every external angle. Padre Pio's spiritual director for many years was Father Benedetto Nardella, who held that role from approximately 1910 until the early 1920s. In letters exchanged between them, now preserved in the archives of the Capuchin Order and partially published in the volume Letters of Padre Pio, Volume 1, edited by Melchiorre of Pobladura and Alessandro of Ripa Bottoni, Padre Pio writes about what he perceives in souls. He writes about souls carrying wounds that have no external cause, wounds that are clean on the outside and hollow inside. He uses the image of a house with the lights on and no one home. And while he is writing about spiritual desolation in a general sense, the confessors who knew him personally confirmed that he applied this understanding most concretely to the lives of married people who had been spiritually vacating their marriages for years. Father Agostino of San Marco in La Mise, another of his early spiritual directors, documented in 1917 a conversation in which Padre Pio said that he feared for the souls of those who received the sacrament of matrimony, and then treat it as if it were a business transaction once the ceremony is over. He said that every year a husband or wife spends in the same house without truly giving themselves to the other is a year in which the grace of the sacrament is being refused. Not violated dramatically, just quietly, consistently refused. Cold, still, present. That refusal does not happen all at once. That is the particular cruelty of it. The testimony of a woman named Giuseppina from the Molise region, who visited San Giovanni Rotondo in 1953, and whose account appears in Di Flumeri's collection, describes a marriage that went cold, not through crisis, but through 1,000 small decisions. Her husband stopped asking her about her day in year 3. He stopped touching her hand in year 5. He stopped looking at her when she spoke in year 7. By year 12, she said, she felt she was living with a very polite stranger who paid the rent. Each of those individual moments was so small, so easy to excuse, so easy not to name, and yet, at the end of 12 years, the sum of all of them was a nearly complete interior divorce that no one around them could see. When she told this to Padre Pio, he told her something that she quoted exactly in her testimony. He said, according to Di Flumeri's record of her account, that the devil does not always attack a marriage with fire. Sometimes he attacks it with patience. He just waits. He lets one small coldness become habit, and then another, and then another. And 20 years later, 2 people who once loved each other are strangers living as roommates, and neither of them can remember the exact moment it happened because it never happened in a single moment. It happened across 1,000. That image, the devil attacking with patience, is one of the most precise descriptions of how emotional abandonment works inside a marriage. It is so gradual that neither person usually identifies a turning point. The withdrawal happens in increments too small to protest. The distance grows in fractions. And then one day, someone is sitting across from Padre Pio in a confessional in 1953 trying to explain why they feel like their marriage died a long time ago, even though no one killed it on any particular day. The year is 1959. A priest named Father Luigi Barbato from the Diocese of Benevento visits San Giovanni Rotondo and speaks with Padre Pio about pastoral cases he is encountering in his parish. He brings the question of married couples who come to him for confession and who are clearly in severe spiritual distress, but whose marriages are, by every measurable canonical standard, valid and intact. He does not know how to counsel them. He does not know what to tell a woman who has been faithful, who has not committed adultery, who has not broken any commandment, and who is nonetheless dying of loneliness inside her vows. He does not know what to tell a man who has provided everything and given nothing of himself, and is now, in his late 50s, realizing he has never been known by his own wife. Father Barbato's account of the conversation that followed, recorded in his personal diary and cited in De Flumery's Acts, describes Padre Pio as speaking with unusual directness on this subject. He told Father Barbato that the wound of presence without giving is one of the most dangerous wounds in Catholic family life, precisely because it does not trigger the usual pastoral responses. No one is being beaten, no one is being unfaithful, the sacrament has not been formally broken, and so it goes unaddressed for decades. It becomes the normal background of a family. Children grow up inside it and learn from it. They learn that love is a performance of duty. They carry that into their own marriages, and the wound spreads from generation to generation without anyone ever naming it as a wound. Padre Pio told Father Barbato that in his 50 years in the confessional, a very high proportion of the deep spiritual desolation he encountered in married people did not come from dramatic sins. It came from this slow erosion, this quiet withdrawal, this choosing over and over not to be truly present to the person you promised yourself to before God. 1,500 people. That was the approximate daily count of those seeking confession from Padre Pio in the peak years of the 1940s and 50s, according to the monastery records cited by Ruffin. 1,500 people every day trying to reach a single old friar in a confessional booth in a small mountain town in southern Italy. Of those, Padre Pio could see directly into the state of souls in a way that witnesses described repeatedly, and that is part of the formal documentation of his beatification cause. He knew things about people he had never met before they finished their first sentence. He turned people away from the confessional, not as punishment, but because he could see they were not yet ready to receive absolution, and sending them forward unprepared would do more harm than good. He sometimes told people the exact sins they had come to confess before they said a word. And among those 1,500 people every day, many of them carried this particular thing: a marriage still technically standing, a life still technically shared, and an interior emptiness that had been growing so long that some of them had forgotten what the alternative felt like. A young woman arrives in 1961. She is 29 years old. She's been married 5 years. She tells Padre Pio she is not sure she loves her husband anymore. She says it quickly, as if confessing a terrible crime. Padre Pio asks her when she stopped feeling loved by him. She is startled by the reframe. She had not thought of it that way. She had thought the problem was her own failure of feeling. He shifts it. He asks her when the conversation stopped. She says, maybe 3 years ago. He asks her if she has told him. She says no. He asks why. She says she did not want to cause a problem. He tells her that 3 years of silence is already a problem, and that the silence itself, chosen daily for 3 years, is a form of withdrawal that mirrors exactly what she's accusing her husband of. That exchange, recorded in the testimony of a woman identified in De Flumery only by her initials, R. from the region of Basilicata, reveals something central to how Padre Pio understood marital presence. He did not divide the blame neatly between the one who withdraws and the one who is left. He saw the dynamic as almost always involving two people, both of whom are making daily choices, often out of fear or exhaustion or pride, to remain in the silence rather than break it. One person's coldness triggers another person's retreat, and each retreat makes the next conversation feel harder and more impossible. Until 15 years have passed and two people are living inside a silence so dense and old that neither of them can imagine the sound of their own voices speaking honestly to the other. This is not to minimize the real cases of one person being genuinely abandoned by the other while continuing to try. Those exist, and those are real. But Padre Pio's pastoral vision was nuanced enough to look at each person individually and ask them about their own choices inside the situation, not just about what was being done to them. The impact on children inside these marriages was something Padre Pio addressed directly and repeatedly. In a conversation documented by Father Carmelo Durante, who lived in San Giovanni Rotondo from 1948 to 1965, and whose testimonies appear in multiple places in the beatification documentation, Padre Pio said that children who grow up watching two parents perform a marriage without living one learn a lesson that no catechism class can easily undo. They learn that love is a maintenance task rather than a gift of self. They learn that you can be married and alone simultaneously. They learn that presence is about body, not spirit. And then they go looking, as adults, for something they cannot name because they have never seen it modeled. He was not speaking from a sentimental place. He was speaking from what he saw in confessionals. The patterns repeated. The children of spiritually absent marriages came back to him years later with the same wound in a slightly different shape. The year is 1964. Padre Pio is 77 years old. He has 4 years left to live. He is tired. His wounds, the stigmata that appeared in September 1918 and never fully healed for 50 years, are by this point exhausting him. He still hears confessions every morning. A man comes to him who is 61 years old and who has been married for 36 years. He does not come to confess infidelity or cruelty. He comes because his wife is dying of cancer, and he has just realized at her bedside the previous week that he does not actually know her. He has slept next to her for 36 years and does not know what she believes about God, does not know what she was afraid of as a child, does not know what she would have done with her life if she had chosen differently. He has provided. He has stayed. He has been, in every functional sense, a husband. And now that she is dying, he realizes, with a grief that is more than grief, that he chose every day for 36 years not to ask, not to know, not to really be there. He is not confessing a sin in the traditional sense. He is confessing a kind of life, and Padre Pio does not dismiss this. He tells the man, according to the account recorded by the friar present that day, that it is not too late, not for absolution, but for arrival. He tells him to go back to his wife's bedside and begin asking the questions he should have asked in year one. He tells him that she's been waiting, that the capacity for intimacy does not disappear with age or illness, that the only thing required is the decision to finally stop being a stranger inside your own marriage. The man returns, according to his own written testimony submitted to the postulators of Padre Pio's beatification cause in 1971, 3 years after Padre Pio's death on September 23, 1968. He writes that he went back to his wife's bedside and began talking to her differently. He says she cried. He says they spent the last 11 weeks of her life talking the way they had never talked in 36 years. He says she died in his arms telling him things she had held for decades. He calls those 11 weeks the only real part of their marriage. He calls the previous 36 years the longest way of being alone he can imagine. Padre Pio saw the pain of marriages that continued without presence, not as a peripheral issue or a soft pastoral concern. He saw it as one of the central spiritual crises of his century. He saw it in 1,500 confessions a day for 5 decades. He saw it in the children it produced and the grandchildren they would produce. He saw it in the spiritual desolation it created in people who, by every external measure, had done everything right. He named it. He took it seriously. He refused to dismiss it as simply the way marriage was. In his collected letters, in the sworn testimonies of those who knew him, in the accounts gathered by D. Flumeri and preserved in the official documentation of his cause, there is a consistency that is striking. Padre Pio believed that the grace of the sacrament of marriage was not automatic. It required 2 people who were choosing every day to actually give themselves to each other, not their labor, not their loyalty in the transactional sense, their actual interior self, the self that was afraid and hopeful and uncertain and real. And every day that choice was refused, quietly, in the small habitual ways that add up to decades of distance, something was being lost that could not be recovered simply by continuing to stay under the same roof. Cold, wood, breath. The rooms were shared, the beds were shared, the years were shared, but the selves were not. And that, he said in one of the most direct documented statements attributed to him on this subject, that is not the sacrament. That is only its appearance. He did not give up on these marriages. That is the other thing the testimonies consistently confirm. He did not counsel people to leave. He did not validate the emptiness by agreeing it was permanent. He pushed. He asked hard questions. He sent people back with specific things to do. Go ask her what she's afraid of. Go tell him you're sorry for the silence. Go sit in the same room and stop pretending everything is fine. The restoration of presence, he insisted, was always possible as long as both people were still breathing. It was not easy, it was not comfortable, but it was possible. And the cost of not attempting it was, in his view, too high to calculate, because the cost was not only to the 2 people in the marriage, it was to the children watching it, it was to the parish around it, it was to the culture that normalized it, and it was to the souls of the 2 people themselves, who were refusing, year after year, one of the primary vehicles through which the grace of their vocation was meant to flow. There is a final testimony that sits differently than the others. It comes from a woman who visited San Giovanni Rotondo, not to confess her own marriage, but to confess her sorrow about her parents' marriage. She was 34 years old, the year was 1957, and she had grown up watching 2 people sleep in the same house for as long as she could remember, without ever once seeming to want to be there together. She had watched her mother go to Mass every morning and come home to a man who ate in silence. She had watched her father work every day and come home to a woman he did not speak to. Neither of them was cruel. Neither of them was unfaithful. They were, she said, perfectly polite. And she said that watching perfectly polite strangers pretend to be a family was the loneliest childhood she could imagine. She comes to Padre Pio because she herself is about to get married and she is terrified. She is terrified of becoming her parents without knowing how it happened to them. She is terrified of the slow disappearance she watched them perform her entire life. She wants to know how to prevent it. Padre Pio's response to her, recorded in her own written account, submitted in 1972, is specific and direct. He tells her that the prevention begins before the silence starts. He tells her that the first time she feels herself pulling away from her husband, the first impulse to stay quiet when she should speak. The first evening she would rather perform contentment than admit a struggle. She should recognize that impulse as the beginning of the thing she watched her parents build for 30 years, and she should name it aloud, to herself, to God, and to her husband. That naming, he tells her, is not weakness. That naming is the only weapon available against the particular patience with which that particular enemy moves. She writes that she married the following year, 1958, and that she has named the silence every time she has felt it coming for the 14 years since. She writes that her husband, confused the first few times, eventually understood what she was doing and began to do it too. She writes that they fight more than her parents ever did. She writes that they are also more alive than her parents ever seemed. Padre Pio died on September 23, 1968, at 81 years of age, in San Giovanni Rotondo. When his body was examined after death, the wounds of the stigmata that had bled for 50 years had completely disappeared. Doctors who examined him confirmed there were no scars, no marks, no tissue damage, where 5 open wounds had bled continuously since September 20th, 1918. The medical community had no explanation, but here's what the formal documentation of his beatification cause contains that almost no one who tells that story includes. In the sworn depositions gathered between 1983 and 1997 by D. Flumeri's team, among the thousands of testimonies organized by category of grace received, there is a section for what the postulators classified as graces received in the context of marriage and family life. It is one of the largest sections in the entire document, larger than the section on physical healings, larger than the section on conversions. The category that appears most frequently within it is not healing from infidelity or alcoholism or abuse. The most frequently cited category is the restoration of communication inside marriages where silence had become the primary language. Hundreds of people, across 5 decades, testifying that something in how Padre Pio received their confession and sent them back to their spouses had broken something open that had been sealed for years. He did not perform miracles on those marriages. He asked questions. He named what he saw. He refused to let people leave without something specific to do. And he did it in a wooden confessional in a mountain town in southern Italy, 16 to 18 hours a day for 52 years. The silence was the wound. The naming was the beginning of the cure. And what he left behind was not a theory about marriage. It was a record of what happens when someone finally decides that staying in the same house is not the same as being there. There are places in the world where this kind of marriage is not an exception. It is the expectation, where the model passed down is not intimacy but endurance, where staying is the virtue and showing up in spirit is never discussed because no one has a word for it. Rural southern Italy in the early 20th century was one of those places. The town of Pietrelcina, where Padre Pio was born in 1887, had a population of fewer than 2,000 people. The economy was subsistence agriculture. Men worked the land, women ran the household. Marriages were arranged or semi-arranged and were understood primarily as economic and reproductive partnerships. Emotional intimacy was not a category that existed in the language available to most people in that context. Padre Pio grew up inside that culture. He understood it from the inside. And yet, his confessional became one of the only places in all of southern Italy where people could come and hear a man tell them that the arrangement was not enough, that God wanted more than the arrangement, that the sacrament required the self, not just the presence of the body in the same building. That is not a small thing to say in Pietrelcina in 1920. That is not a small thing to say to a woman in 1932 who has been told her entire life that a husband who does not beat her and does not leave her is a good husband. That is not a small thing to say to a man in 1959 who has fulfilled every expectation his culture placed on him and who is being told, for the first time in his 61 years, that fulfillment of expectations is not the same as the gift of self. Padre Pio said it anyway, thousands of times, across 5 decades, in a small wooden booth in a small mountain town. And the testimonies preserved in the formal documentation of his cause confirmed that people heard it and went home and tried. Some of them succeeded, some of them failed. But all of them left knowing the name of the wound, and the name as the woman from the Molise region told her daughter, and as her daughter repeated to the postulators in 1989, was the beginning. Consider what we actually know about the confessional in practical terms. The confessional at the Church of Our Lady of Grace in San Giovanni Rotondo, where Padre Pio heard confessions, was a standard capuchin structure, approximately 1 meter wide on the penitent's side, with a wooden grill separating the 2 compartments. The lines to reach it sometimes stretched for days. People camped on the ground outside the monastery. They traveled from France and Germany and the United States in the post-war years, spending money they did not easily have, waiting in lines that moved at the pace of whoever was on the other side of the grill. One person could spend 5 minutes with him, another might spend half an hour. The difference was never about the complexity of the sin. It was, witnesses consistently reported, about what he saw in the soul and what he believed that soul needed. A woman named Elena Bandini from Bologna, whose testimony appears in De Flumeri's collection, waited 4 days to make her confession. She arrived in the summer of 1952. She had traveled 450 kilometers. She had told her husband she was visiting her sister. She had not told him where she was actually going because she did not know how to explain what she needed. What she needed was for someone to tell her whether the numbness she felt inside her 15-year marriage was a spiritual failure on her part or a response to something real. She needed to know if God was asking her to try harder to feel something she no longer felt, or if the absence of feeling was itself information about something that had gone wrong. Padre Pio told her it was both. He told her that numbness inside a marriage is often the soul's response to years of not being received, not being heard, not being seen. He told her that she had stopped offering herself emotionally because the offering kept landing in silence. And he told her that this was understandable, but that it had now become its own kind of withdrawal, and that both the cause and the response needed to be addressed. He asked her to do 2 things. First, to tell her husband directly and without softening it that she felt alone inside their marriage. And second, to pray every day for the courage to remain open, even if he responded badly the first time. She writes that she went home and told her husband. She writes that he responded badly the first time. And the second time, she writes that on the 3rd attempt, somewhere in October of 1952, he broke down and told her something he had never told anyone, something from before their marriage, something that had made him afraid of being close to anyone for reasons that had nothing to do with her. She writes that she had been married to this man for 15 years and had never known this thing about him. She writes that she had lived next to a wound she never knew existed. That pattern appears more than once in the testimonies. The partner who seems to be withdrawing is often carrying something they have never told anyone, a shame they have held since childhood, a grief they decided to manage alone, a fear so old they do not even know anymore what it is a fear of. They married. They tried to be present. The weight of the unspoken thing pulled them back. And over time, the distance became the habit, and the habit became the marriage, and neither person knew how the gap had opened or what was living in it. Padre Pio did not treat this as an excuse for the withdrawal. He treated it as information about where the healing needed to begin, not with the behavior, but with the buried thing beneath the behavior. That is a sophisticated piece of pastoral psychology for a Capuchin friar born in a village of under 2,000 people in 1887. It is more sophisticated than what most people were hearing from most priests in most parishes in most of the 20th century. He had gifts that went beyond what psychology can account for. The ability to know a soul's state without being told. The ability to see, according to multiple witnesses, the spiritual condition of the person sitting on the other side of the grill before they had spoken a word. But he did not rely on the supernatural perception alone. He asked questions, specific questions. He pushed. He sent people back with concrete instructions. And then sometimes he prayed over the marriage in a way that witnesses described as feeling like something shifted that they could not name. Father Carmelo Durante, in one of his testimonies, describes a couple who came to San Giovanni Rotondo separately in 1951. They had not coordinated it. They had not told each other they were going. They each arrived on different days, each waiting in the same line, each confessing to the same man. Padre Pio did not tell either of them that the other had been there, but he told each of them separately the same thing, in different words, that the other person was suffering, that the other person was trying, that the silence between them was being held in place by 2 people equally afraid to break it. And he told each of them to be the one who broke it first. They returned home, according to Father Durante's account, and within 2 weeks, one of them finally spoke. He does not record which one. He only records that the woman, years later, described the moment her husband first said aloud that he was sorry, that he had been afraid, and that he did not know how to stop being afraid alone, as the day her marriage began. Not the wedding day. The day in 1951 when a man who had been married for 12 years finally said something true. The year of Padre Pio's birth, 1887. The year his stigmata appeared, 1918. The year he died, 1968. Between the stigmata and his death, 50 years of confessions. Between his death and the beatification proceedings, 15 years. Between the beatification proceedings and his canonization on June 16th, 2002 by Pope John Paul II, nearly 20 years more. Across all of that time, across all of the documentation gathered and reviewed and sworn to and verified, the category of marriage kept appearing. The wound of presence without self, the damage of decades of polite cohabitation without genuine meeting. It is a wound that has no visible marks. That is why it is so dangerous. That is why it lasted 15 years for Elena Bandini before she traveled 450 kilometers to find someone who would name it. That is why the man from Campania spent 22 years in a house with a woman he never asked about her own life. That is why the girl who grew up watching her parents perform a marriage for 30 years almost didn't understand what she was afraid of until she sat across from an old friar in a wooden booth and heard him say it plainly. There are no visible marks, but there is a record. Sworn testimonies, biographical documentation, a woman named R.C. from Basilicata with initials preserved in a legal document, Elena Bandini's letter, the man from Campania's written account submitted to postulators in 1971, hundreds of entries in the largest section of Di Flumeri's acts, all of them pointing to the same thing. The marriage was intact, the house was standing, and inside it, for years, sometimes decades, no one had been home.